Let me just go through quickly and introduce everyone so we can start our conversation. Dave Fahey here, Director of Chemical Sciences Laboratory at NOAA. Sarah Doherty, an atmospheric scientist and program director at the University of Washington Marine Cloud Brightening Program. Jessica Seaton, Senior Fellow and Lecturer at Jackson School of Foreign Affairs. And Joshua Ampasan, founder of Green Africa Youth Organization. So we're going to talk now a little more big picture. We talked about heat and sort of more immediate kind of interventions, issues, public health issues and things. Now we're going to move to sort of bigger picture questions about climate interventions on a larger scale. And Dave, to start this, I want to start with you. In that video, Jean-Francois just talked about the importance of a baseline of, if anyone's going to start manipulating in any way these kind of interventions with the climate, we need to understand what we're doing, obviously. Give us a little cheat sheet about like the state of play right now, and what are the most important things, for example, that we don't know? What is the baseline we're at right now?
Very good question, Jeff. I think I'm not quite on yet. Baseline is a really important word in the scientific approach to this particular topic, and indeed to the stratosphere in general. We've been interested in the stratosphere for decades because that's where the ozone layer is. So there's a strong parallel of understanding the processes associated with climate intervention with those associated with ozone depletion. So again, baseline. And baseline in this case means the chemistry and composition of the stratosphere. It's a more quiescent place than the troposphere where we live, but it's not that quiescent. And so there are seasonal changes, there's latitude differences, etc. Climate change is changing things. We change things by emitting refrigerants, for example. And there's this aerosol population that comes from, has a large natural source and anthropogenic source in the troposphere. And so that result in this kind of standing aerosol layer. We've known about this, of course, for a long time. We have stratospheric aircraft, as we just saw in the video, that fly through it, but we're not where we need to be in terms of really understanding the processes that control the abundance, the size distribution, and the composition of stratospheric aerosol. And without that, scientific opinion would say we're not really in the position that we need to be to perturb that layer by injecting more sulfur, for example, or some other material, and think that we know what's going to happen. And as Jean-Francois said in the video, you need to know what's there, you need to know how it interacts with the radiation field to really know what you will be doing, how your intended outcome may differ from the actual outcome. So my laboratory in particular is invested in that baseline. We're directed directly from Congress in what's called the Earth's Radiation Budget Program in NOAA to go out and baseline it. And it's not simply a climate intervention issue. It's accounting for all the changes in the stratosphere. As Kelly said in the video, there's stratospheric aircraft, there's wildfires, in addition to the things we might do, and volcanoes. All of that plays together, confounds the problem a bit, makes it more interesting. And so my laboratory is invested in finding that out. I call it kind of the $1 million data set. That's probably too small of a number. That we know, my laboratory knows more about the nature of the aerosol in the stratosphere today in both hemispheres than any other group in terms of very specific parameters. And it's kind of a yawn for a lot of people, like, okay, you figured that out. But the value will increase in time when we start changing it or nature starts changing it. It's the question of, well, what was it back then? And I maintain the richest country in the world can't take yesterday's data. And so we're in that process, and Congress has asked us to do that because I would say they don't want surprises about, well, what was going on? Don't you guys know what's going to happen? Don't you know what somebody else might have done? So maybe I'll pause there.
So let me just ask one quick follow-up, just to push a little bit more specifics about that. That's really important. But from a what would you say is from a aerosol point of view and climate intervention point of view, when we think about this, what is the single biggest sort of data hole you have? If you could know one thing, what is the most important missing piece for you when you think about this in the big picture?
Yeah, which present do you want for Christmas? The soundbite we would use when we talk to Congress or talk to our funding sources, the stratosphere is critically under-observed. And so you saw the small balloons in the video. Well, they're just a tiny little slice through the atmosphere, and there's a lot of other atmosphere they didn't go through. So we're critically undersampled. And so just knowing, actually Jean-Francois said it in the video, where is the aerosol and what's it made out of and how's it going to be different tomorrow? That's a big Christmas present, but that's what I'd say.
I'll talk to Santa. Sarah, so you work on marine cloud brightening, you work on aerosols very specifically. I'm interested, first of all, just in again, big picture way, how you think about this paradox that we face right now, which is that as we clean up the air with better fuels for ships and shutting down coal plants, we are escalating the risk of heat and temperatures because we're removing aerosols from the air. So I'm interested in, from a person who's interested in how we're going to change albedo and change the amount of aerosols in the atmosphere and the effect of clouds and things like that. But how do you think about this basic paradox that we find ourselves in right now?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not my call either. We're just gonna cycle this one. I think it's great that we're cleaning up the air to start with. So, I mean, it's a paradox in that it's improving one thing and causing a bit of another problem in the process. But I guess I don't think of it as a paradox. I think it's a really good thing that we're cleaning up the air. And I am currently directing a program to understand whether we could intentionally add aerosols, sea salt aerosols, to clouds to make them reflect more sunlight in a cool climate. But for the past 20, 25 years, I've been studying the effects of existing pollution aerosols on the climate system and how they're cooling climate. So while it's unfortunate that cleaning up the air is adding to climate warming, we are getting some really interesting information out of it, particularly in the last few years. As you mentioned, there's been a dramatic reduction in the emissions of particles from ships, which was put in place through a International Maritime Office regulation that went into effect very suddenly in 2020, and it resulted in a 80% decrease in particulate emissions from cargo ships. And we expected it to take sort of 5 years before we'd see the signal from that in how those particles were affecting cloud reflectivity. And instead, we're already seeing, it's in sort of 3 years, 2 years. You were starting, well, it depends on which parameter you look at, but we were very quickly seeing a signal from that. There's also a big cleanup of aerosols from China, and we don't have the data. The data is just starting to come out on how much of a reduction in those aerosols there were, but that's also an opportunity to study how much particulate pollution affects cloud reflectivity.
So I have a follow-up to this. So when we think about aerosols and we think about the impacts and them as interventions, clouds are very different, right? I mean, clouds are regional. Clouds are what's above your head and what's above an area, not something that is, circulating in the stratosphere. Talk a little bit about how clouds function as an intervention versus a larger sort of injection of aerosols or in the stratosphere, about regional versus global interventions.
Yeah, I mean, so, clouds are incredibly important to the climate system. They're very effective at reflecting sunlight and cooling the climate naturally. Fairly small increases in the reflection of sunlight by clouds can have a pretty significant climate impact. Marine cloud brightening is different from stratospheric aerosol injection in that there's specific cloud regions. There's specific types of clouds that will be most amenable to brightening. You can't add particles to any cloud under any condition and have it get brighter. There are specific cloud types that would need to be targeted with marine cloud brightening, and that means there's just specific regions of the globe where you could do marine cloud brightening. So that the big question that needs to be answered both for stratospheric aerosol injection and marine cloud brightening is, if you did it in specific ways, specific amounts in specific locations, how would that affect the climate system? And that's a little bit of a harder question to answer with marine cloud brightening than with stratospheric aerosol injection, but we're starting to do that through global modeling. It's the same models that we use to predict how climate change in general is going to play out, and we are finding patterns of cloud brightening that would induce circulation responses that would not be great. They might change rainfall significantly in some area in a way you wouldn't want to, but other combinations of marine cloud brightening, brightening specific regions that actually do more closely reverse the warming from greenhouse gases. So I think with marine cloud brightening, we'll need to be, there's more work that needs to be done in terms of exploring the specific ways that it could be implemented and how those would play out in the climate system.
So I have to say, one of the things when I was working on my book, How to Cool the Planet, that I loved most was understanding the complexity of clouds. And it's one of the things that I talked about with my kids all the time. It was totally fascinating to lay on the grass and talk to my kids about the complexity of clouds and the ongoing complexity of that understanding. And there was just a piece, Science, I think, just the other day about new breakthroughs in this, and it's just a fascinating area. So, Jessica, at the conference here, yesterday or day before yesterday, there was a discussion about AGU's ideas, proposals about research and the sort of 5 principles of how we're going to think about climate intervention research. You think about these kinds of things all the time about, obviously this is not just a technological conversation, this is an incredibly complex political conversation also in all kinds of ways. How do you balance the, go slow, let's be careful, let's be transparent, all those kinds of things, with the things that we talked about in the first panel, and what I wrote about in my heat book, which is this is getting worse fast, and people are dying, and we need to do something. Those are very powerful kind of conflicting forces, and I'm interested in how you think about that.
That's an excellent question that in some ways is the question for being able to figure out an appropriately open space for the kind of research that we need. In addition to the AGU principles, I'd also call attention to the principles that the UK Advanced Research and Invention Agency has put out to describe how it's governing its research funding for exploring climate cooling. One of them, it has a balance between seeking decision-relevant information, commitment to respect and transparency, and I think one of the important ones that's in its principles is also awareness of the wider ramifications of the research for the potential development of this capability. And just full disclosure, so I'm the interim chair of the oversight committee for that program, so I did help write those principles, but I think that they're in some ways an expression of an intention to balance, and they're worth looking at And I know the ARIA team hopes that they also set a little bit of a different framing. So that's one, but the bigger, to back up from principles and statements of principles about research, and in some ways there are an increasing number of them, and it's important to state those. But the big, in some ways, fear in the background with these principles is, if we move forward on this research, if we move forward from ideas and potentials into something that is more like a technology. These are not technologies yet. These are, ideas that may move. If we build it, it will be used, and it will be used badly. And that's certainly a fear. And it's been expressed in statements about the need to limit research, and in statements about a ban, moratorium, et cetera. I think it's important to look at, to look at those and to really think about human potential, because in some ways that fear, if we build it, it will be used, is certainly not without historical precedent, but it's also in some ways a failure of an imagination, and it's very lopsided pessimism about humans. A lot of times the debate about research is framed in sort of risk. So the status quo is not okay. We've seen these kinds of heat discussions. You look at nonlinear climate change. I mean, there's the status quo is not okay. So we need to balance the risks of kind of moving into an intervention space, risks of the status quo. That's nice because it really points out the status quo is not okay. We're not in pre-industrial times. Maybe this risk can be balanced. But really, there's another risk, which is around human agency, which is there's a serious risk that we will not get it together to mitigate and adapt sufficiently. I mean, just look at the precedent. There is also a risk that we will use these capabilities if we develop them badly. Both of those, how do you reduce both of those risks simultaneously, is through research. Research in characterizing the impact of aerosols, the near-term climate, the near-term warming, the variation in warming, the regional variations, moving away from a global average to expression of this is what is going to happen in your county, in your nation. Research to inform, to motivate. Second is research for governance. The ability to steer this class of ideas should intervention. I mean, Jean-François brought up some of the uncertainties. Sarah brought up some of the points about, these clouds are not everywhere. Should this turn out to be a feasible way to get to rapid cooling, the ability to steer that depends on being able to monitor. It depends on being able to attribute and course correct in a short period of time. It depends on having distributed ability to make decisions about this, which depends on the distribution of access to local scale climate modeling and climate understanding. I mean, these are this research agenda that is joint between mitigating the human risk of two kinds of failures, one of which is not moving fast enough on mitigation and adaptation, one of which is using these new potential things badly. Mitigating both of those points to more research. And it's just, in some ways, insane to me that we can't look at it that way and have a little more faith that, maybe we could get it together to behave differently than maybe we have in the past. But it's lopsided pessimism to say that we would use this badly, but we would all of a sudden move really quickly on everything good.
Joshua, how's your mic? Does it work? All right. Yeah. So, Joshua, I want to follow up with what she was saying about local impacts, but also about, can't we just, do this right kind of thing. When I talk to people from the global south who are thinking about climate intervention, it's no secret there are a lot of people who say, forget it. This is, I mentioned in the opening that I first heard about this from this Pentagon weaponeer who was, wanted, part of this sort of Star Wars thing. So there's a lot of people in the global south who say this is a crazy idea by, crazy technocrats who want to control, who want to control our world, and we're not going to have any voice in it. And it's going to maybe help people in the developed world, or make people in Miami's condo, the sea level not rise so fast for their condo investment. But for us in sub-Saharan Africa and Bangladesh or anywhere like that, it's just, who cares? So there's a lot of pushback from the Global South on this. I want to hear your thoughts about that.
Thanks. And it's complex and it's difficult, honestly. So currently, we are the state of art is that we don't talk about this, right? There's a huge lack of trust, and we need to think about where does that come from. And that's why, Jessica, I really like your point about what has happened in the past and what has been the precedent. And that is that most climate solutions we know have really not had a very strong Global South inclusion in the development of it. So we don't have clean water for people to drink, but we believe that we can have enough water to create cooling spaces, right? Who came up with that idea, and how is that even possible for a Global South government to accept that this could actually happen, right? There is not enough institutional capacity to engage in scientific conversations, yet we are supposed to believe that we can be included in scientific assessment when talking about complex issues and emerging topics. So I think that there hasn't been enough in the past that really give that confidence. It doesn't mean that we need to keep projecting that that is what's going to keep happening, because we have a real opportunity for every new issue to change something and to make those changes. And there are three key areas which I think would need to keep changing to be able to do that. And one of them is academia. The entire sort of scientific and research framework as we have it now is not built and designed to favor Global South researchers. And we have to just accept the truth that this is what it is and this is what we've invested in, and we need to embrace that reality and say we want to change that. So even when I'll use Africa as a very good example, even when climate research funding is specifically dedicated for Africa, 78% of that still sits in Global North institutions. And the lead authorship will still be done by Global North researchers, which automatically put a lot of expertise and the sort of holders of knowledge being the researcher in the Global North. And that has a huge implication on who gets invited into what room to contribute to what conversation and develop new processes. What that does again is, particularly for most people that I work with, young people and thinking of Africa again, is that if you think of a continent with 70% of it being young people, thinking of issues like heat, where there are not literally any university program training anyone on how to deal with heat, right? So if the research funding is not going to such universities for professors and sort of researchers to do work on this, there's no way to build talent and pipeline for such a pending issue that is already existing and is going to keep compounding. So that is a huge sector that is. The second part is just the financial architecture of where is money flowing to, who has access to resources and funding. And then the third part is how do we get more people to contribute to climate intervention research? Because as it stands now, when we talk about heat, we talk about data. It's not just data, it's also lack of institutional capacity of local health institutions, local governments, to understand what is the scale of the issue. And typically when we use the global average, which I really don't like, because what that does is that it makes it look like we are all on the same playing field or same playground, but we are not. And that means that if people certain countries or communities don't have the capacity to understand their, not even national, but sub-national, local level data and assessment, they can plan effectively. So that is really important. And how do we resource local researchers to be able to do research locally that help to inform these institutions on the scale of the issue and how best to respond to that. So this is where I think we have a huge opportunity to close those gaps. We are already starting work. Green Africa Youth Organization started work this year, working with 4 universities across Africa, introducing courses on CDR and SRM, for instance. And it will shock you the number of young people who actually saw that this could be a career path for them. And this is the realism I talk about in the video as well. It's realizing that it took so long to fight for adaptation. It's taken too long to fight for loss and damage. It's not going to happen on the time scales that is needed to protect lives. So you just have to realize that we have to cool the planet, and we need to build enough research capacity everywhere around the world to be able to do it, and that is how we can make progress. So investing in the capacity of young scientists, early career researchers in countries like that and regions where this is really urgent become extremely fundamental. So we've seen the progress on that. But having said that, it's something that needs to scale across everywhere to be able to do this. And then the policymakers is another thing. A lot of the policymakers now are like, we don't talk about this, but a lot of it is also because they don't even know what we are talking about. I've been in so many conversations where we're talking about solar radiation management or modification, and the first thing that a negotiator in the UNFCCC will tell me is that, oh yeah, we've done some work about this. We're going to produce solar energy to about 15 communities, and completely talk about two different things, and walk out of the room thinking they know that what they are talking about and they have enough, understanding on this. So how do we also recognize that we can't even have the conversation if we don't build capacity to have the conversation? If you want to invite someone to the room to talk about something, they need to have some basic, primarily fundamental knowledge about the issue, and currently that doesn't exist. So we have governments, we have negotiators, we have government officials who are literally relying on NGOs to tell them what to say and what not to say. And there is nothing more colonial than that, than have a whole government institution representing a country listen to one tiny NGO in Europe tell them, go in and we don't talk about this topic because it's not in your interest. And because they don't have any knowledge on this is what they're going to defend. And we saw this at the UNIA earlier this year. So it's really important that it's not the Global South argument and the youth argument. Typically, I think is being approached from a moral perspective. But I think that is really not the main reason why we need to do it. It's not a moral argument. It's an argument of proximity, efficiency, and making progress. And if we don't do it, we're just not going to get there.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I think it goes to the lack of understanding about what the real impacts will be, and to the degree that it can help in the global South too, because we have failed so much on adaptation and loss and damages and things like that. So the assumption that it's going to be bad is very naive, right? So I want to, Dave, go back to you. I want to go back to thinking about going forward now, about what the kinds of structures we need to build and how we need to think about this if we were going to take this seriously. And you and I had a conversation in the hallway about the Montreal Protocol as a kind of archetype for scientific research and for thinking about this moving forward. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. The Montreal Protocol that controls ozone-depleting gases, meaning those in your refrigerator, etc., is widely considered the most successful environmental treaty of all time, or so far. And so it stands as, just from that fact alone, as a template for what you might want to do for climate intervention research. And I personally am deeply involved in the Montreal Protocol, and if you look into it, it has a scientific assessment panel that I use the term they're a gatekeeper for the scientific facts and understanding that the delegates, the parties to the protocol, rely on, use as a foundation for their decision making. And it was kind of it came about, they had to find their way, so to speak, because there wasn't a template when they started. So we have this template, and we've seen how policy and science can work together quite effectively over decades, literally. And I would say the main mitigation that the scientific assessment panel does is it kind of cleans up the scientific neighborhood. That science is by itself kind of has this random entropy disorganization to it because everyone's doing their thing. And what really matters is to synthesize and kind of get above the individual tasks. And of course, IPCC does this too. And scientists want, I maintain, to be part of, to have their work synthesized and to try and hopefully their work will influence things. So in my mind, climate intervention, whether you're talking about SAI or MCB, would benefit from picking up that template, because we'd like the second most successful environmental treaty to be about climate intervention. You could make that argument today. And I assert that the world is paying an opportunity cost And Joshua just went through the Global South perspective. We're paying an opportunity cost every day that we don't have a comprehensive scientific assessment of climate intervention. And I say science because I would posit that anything to do with governance, as you see in the Montreal Protocol, will want that part of the discussion to rely on a scientific foundation. Because if the science is moving around or there's a fog of confusion, everything else will be confused. And so I come from the science side. I'm see the effectiveness of the Montreal Protocol and really personally looking for a way to advance that cause. And then you get into the chapter, well, where would you do it? And that's a question that really should be answered these days. But yeah, SRM would benefit from a climate assessment. Scientific assessment.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. So I want to wrap this up with a question for both Sarah and Jessica here, maybe starting with Sarah. So we talk about science, and we talk about assessments, we talk about observations, we talk about, opportunity cost, which I think is something that is not talked about a lot in the climate intervention world. I was at Asilomar in 2010 when, the Asilomar, there was a conference at Asilomar about, trying to come up with guidelines and ethics for geoengineering. It's more or less where we are right now with the AGU thing. There's differences, but that's 14 years ago, right? Or whatever it was. So how do we move forward? So Sarah, you had a project that was, shut down. We can't even do basic science research. To get anywhere with this, we have to be able to at least be able to do basic science, not to mention where are we going to do it, as you mentioned. So how do we get over that impasse? Where does that go?
Well, I wish I could easily answer that question of how we get past that, but I do think the issue that you described of people thinking they know what this stuff is, but not actually really understanding it, and in particular thinking they understand what doing research in this area would mean. It gets very conflated. Doing the research gets very conflated with doing deployment, and the idea that if you do the research, well, then you're going to deploy. It may be that if you do the research, you find out it's just a lot more complicated. Then it's easy without doing the research to oversimplify these things. I do have people saying to me, I've actually had people say to me, why aren't we not doing marine cloud writing right now? We've got global warming happening. We're seeing climate impacts. Why don't we go do it right now? And of course, the more we research these things, the more complex we realize they are. So I think there's a communication problem. I think people don't understand that the research that we would want to do with these particularly initial field studies is really, it's basic climate research. I say to people, even if somebody told me tomorrow, marine cloud writing will never happen, we shouldn't be researching it anymore, I would want to continue we'd want to continue doing the same research that we're planning to do to understand marine cloud brightening, simply because it's a way, it gives us a new tool for some of the approaches we're using are new tools, giving us new tools for how to study how aerosols are already affecting clouds, which is the biggest source of uncertainty in how humans are driving climate change right now, is how pollution particles are changing clouds. So it's a difficult problem of needing people to better understand what SRM is, what these approaches are, understand that the urgency of the problem, the timeline problem, how quickly climate is changing, and that these are the only approaches that have been identified that could rapidly reduce climate warming, and that the research is basic climate research. If we do get to research these things out to the point where, we've done field studies to at the smaller scales, and you're wanting to get into doing field studies at larger scales, then there's a conversation that really needs to be had about how to make decisions about doing field studies like that, where you might have impacts on the weather or the climate, even temporarily. But the work that needs to be done, that like the project we were trying to do, is just, it's such fundamental science research, and it's got such potential benefits for understanding the climate system right now, even outside of SRM. But I think it's a big communication lift.
So, Jessica, let me let you have the last word on this, and that is about what Sarah's talking about. This, and you mentioned this idea of the slippery slope. That's what's always stopping all of this, right? Is that we can't do even the most basic research because it'll be the slippery slope to next thing we know, we are, sending airplanes around and manipulating the climate, and it's like, so my question is not only how do we deal with this slippery slope question, but how do we deal with it in an era of political polarization like we have right now, where I don't think it's too much to suggest that science is not the highest. We're not moving into an era in America where the sort of where science is how should I put it, as respected as it should be. Given all that, how do we move forward on this?
Thanks. I think I'll just head back to. All right, this isn't on. Sorry, I broke your mic, Josh. Oh, okay, now it's working. All right, so, if you want to go historical, you mentioned 2010, Silomar. I started working on kind of atmosphere stuff with black carbon in 2005, 6. And, we're having the same conversations today, a little bit advanced. And one of the reasons for that is that I think the underlying mental models of how Earth system dynamics work are not widely shared in the non-scientific, including in the environmental policy world. And so I think there's an important communication role that is science-based, but there's an important mental model shifting role to build a deeper, wider understanding of aerosols, of how particles in the atmosphere have different effects than gases, about Earth's energy imbalance and the metaphors we use for the accumulation and momentum. That's not just science, it's maybe earlier intervention. One of the things I do in my Yale program is I teach an Earth system science for public policy for environmental policy people who haven't thought about it that way. And you can see the light bulbs start to go off in connecting, how do I steer this kind of thing? So that's a very wishy-washy answer because it's probably too slow. I think the faster answer here, but again, very much in sort of the mental model, a more positive imagination, is we have to be able to show how deployment could be good. That it could be a new re-engagement in global collective response to the environment. Not that it will be, not overselling it, not painting fairy tales, not being naive, because the history, as Josh pointed out, we don't do any of this very well. It's not like shifting to renewables is going to be all positive and light and everything, but somehow making the potential to use these things less scary, plausibly steerable with effort, is I think maybe the shorter way to unlock some of maybe a little more comfort with the research. And that's a huge trust lift, and I don't think it's going to necessarily, and I think the US has to play a role in it, but I think at this point we need multiple countries. And the model that I have in terms of governance is where the Climate and Clean Air Coalition came from. Not the Climate and Clean Air Coalition playing a role in it, but a model of a club of a few countries, some NGOs, a scientific advisory panel, kind of moving into creating a science peer learning start that has moved and grown and changed. We have to show that this is steerable in a way that could be positive.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you. Having mic troubles. Thank you very much. Thank you all on the panel for this. This has been a great discussion. I think I just want to say that having thought about this for a long time, I do think that there's a kind of momentum towards this, for better or for worse. And we'll have to see how this plays out, given the politics of the moment and everything. But it is sort of what one journalist once called a bad idea whose time has come. And I want to thank Kelly and everyone at SilverLining. This is a really hard topic to talk about in a kind of sober way. And I want to thank all of you on the panel and in the previous panel for helping us do that today in a sober and kind of, shall I say, non-hysterical kind of way. It's a really hard thing to talk about. And we did, I think we, from my point of view, you guys did a great job. So thank you very much, and thank you all for coming.
I'd like to thank you all for coming and encourage you to engage with the panel. We have refreshments and drinks at the back. But more importantly, Jeff Goodell is here. We have copies of his book, The Heat Will Kill You First, that we'd like to share with you, signed by Jeff. So please join in the back if you can stay for a few minutes. Thank you again for coming. I know you're a distinguished group too, so I hope that the panelists will have a chance to talk with you. It's a terrific science community around this issue, and we're really, really grateful to have you here. So thank you again.